final resting place of ancient Egyptian Queen Nefertiti could finally have been discovered thanks to advances in modern technology.
For over a century, Queen Nefertiti has been treated as one of the most important women in ancient history.
Nefertiti is the most important queen in Egypt.
Her face is everywhere, her body is nowhere. When scientists finally turned to DNA to resolve this contradiction, the results did not confirm what historians expected. They dismantled it. What emerged was not a story of dynastic continuity or inherited power, but a biological truth that forced experts to rethink everything they thought they knew. Nefertiti as the most visible woman in ancient history. When historians speak about visibility in ancient Egypt, no woman comes close to Nefertiti. Her image appears across the landscape of the 18th dynasty in a way that no other queen can match. She is carved on temple walls, palace reliefs, boundary markers, and ritual scenes that shaped how the state presented itself to the public. These were not private decorations meant only for palace interiors. They were official statements placed in spaces meant to be seen by priests, officials, and the wider population. Her face was not reduced in size or pushed behind the king. It was positioned where authority was displayed and reinforced. What makes this unusual is not just how often she appears, but how she appears. Other queens are typically shown standing behind their husbands, smaller in scale, watching from the margins. Nefertiti is presented differently.
King Akhenaten and his wife looked completely different than all the other ancient Egyptian kings.
She is depicted at the same size as the ruler. In several scenes, she performs actions traditionally reserved for pharaohs. She is shown striking enemies, presenting offerings directly to the gods, and standing alone beneath the sun disk of Aten. In ancient Egyptian art, these details mattered. Size and placement were carefully controlled choices used to signal who held power and who did not. Her presence also extends beyond formal ceremony. Nefertiti is closely associated with the Amarna period, a short and disruptive phase when Egypt's leadership abandoned the long-standing system of many gods and elevated the worship of a single sun disk called Aten. This shift altered temples, rituals, and the public image of authority itself. Images from this period show Nefertiti repeatedly appearing in scenes tied to these changes. She is shown participating in official state rituals that define the new order. Her image is placed at the center of these transformations, visually binding her to the authority of the state. It is at this point that assumption entered the story. Because Nefertiti was so publicly embedded in power, many concluded that she must also have been central to the royal bloodline. Over time, this belief hardened. She was widely assumed to be the woman who gave birth to the next ruler of Egypt, or at least a key biological link in the line of succession. Yet when historians searched for direct evidence, the record did not support this confidence. Ancient texts offer no confirmed account of her parents. No inscription clearly identifies her as the mother of any reigning king. For decades, historians made a simple leap. Because Nefertiti's image dominated temples and state monuments, she was treated as if she must have played a central role in producing and sustaining the royal bloodline. Many assumed she was directly responsible for passing power from one generation to the next. This belief was not supported by a clear inscription, a named burial, or an explicit statement in the records. It endured because it sounded logical, not because it was proven. Over time, repetition turned that assumption into accepted history. If Nefertiti stood at the center of power, then her remains should have been protected, named, and preserved with exceptional care. They were not. The abnormal disappearance of Nefertiti's body. For more than a century, archaeologists have searched for Nefertiti where logic says she should be. Royal tombs have been opened, burial corridors have been mapped, mummies moved, hidden, or reburied during times of chaos have been catalogued and studied. Again and again, the same question returns without an answer. Where is Nefertiti's body? This has not been a casual or incomplete search. Egypt's royal burial zones have been examined in detail since the late 19th century. Kings, queens, royal children, secondary wives, and distant relatives from the same period have been recovered and, in many cases, identified by name. Yet when it comes to the most prominent royal woman of the age, the physical record goes silent. No body securely identified as Nefertiti has ever been placed before scholars for study. For a queen of her rank, this is not normal. Royal women connected to the throne were not buried quietly or without record. Their deaths were documented. Their bodies were prepared according to strict ritual rules. Their tombs were marked to preserve their names and identities for eternity. Even queens who later fell out of favor were usually buried with their titles intact. Complete disappearance without trace or identification was rare. The contrast becomes sharper when we look at who has survived. Archaeologists have identified mummies belonging to lesser wives, royal daughters, and secondary figures who held far less influence than Nefertiti. Some of these burials were damaged. Some bodies were moved during later unrest, yet traces remained. Names survived on coffins, amulets, or fragments of burial equipment. Nefertiti stands apart because nothing comparable has been found. In ancient Egypt, burial was not simply about death. It was about identity. Royal women were laid to rest with inscriptions that named them, listed their titles, and placed them within the family line. These details were believed to guarantee recognition in the afterlife. Removing a name or destroying a body meant more than loss. It meant erasure from both history and eternity. Because of this, many scholars argue that the loss of a queen's body often signals political action rather than accident. Tomb robbery alone does not fully explain it. Grave robbers targeted gold and valuables. They did not usually remove names carved in stone or erase identities completely. When both a body and its identifying markers vanish, scholars begin to look beyond chance. Some researchers suggest that this kind of removal had lasting effects. Without a body, there could be no burial cult. Without a name, there could be no public memory. This made it easier for later rulers to reshape succession, silence inconvenient figures, and control how the past was remembered. In this way, disappearance became a tool with consequences, not just a mystery. Nefertiti's disappearance also aligns with a period of severe instability. After the collapse of the Aten-centered religious experiment, Egypt moved quickly to restore its traditional gods. Power shifted. Alliances broke. According to some reports, this was a time when names were erased from monuments, and entire chapters of history were deliberately suppressed. In such a climate, disappearance carries weight. What makes this absence so disturbing is not just that Nefertiti is missing, but how abruptly she vanishes. She does not fade gradually from the record. One moment she is central to state imagery, then she is gone. No tomb, no identified remains, no burial texts, no physical anchor. This absence is not a loose thread at the edge of the story. It sits at the center of it. With her body missing and the written record offering no answers, historians were forced to rely on assumption. Much later, scientists would approach that same silence with methods that did not depend on belief at all. What scholars assumed about Nefertiti before DNA. By the time modern archaeology matured, one assumption had already settled into place. Many scholars treated Nefertiti as biologically central to the royal line, most often as the mother of Tutankhamun or as a key figure through whom succession passed. This belief was rarely stated as a hard claim, but it shaped interpretation everywhere. It became the background logic against which evidence was read. Museums played a major role in this process. Display labels often described Nefertiti in ways that implied maternal importance without saying it outright. Her image would appear beside discussions of royal succession, allowing visitors to draw their own conclusions. Documentaries followed the same pattern. When narrators spoke about the birth of the next pharaoh, her face frequently filled the screen. The connection was suggested through repetition rather than proven through records. What made this assumption especially strong was how silence was handled. Instead of treating missing information as a problem to be solved, many researchers treated it as neutral or even meaningful. According to some interpretations, the lack of direct statements was explained as a result of lost records or ceremonial convention. The question of proof was quietly set aside. It is important to understand that this was not carelessness. Scholars were working with the tools available to them. They relied on texts, images, and patterns of representation. All of these require interpretation. None of them can confirm biological relationships on their own. That limitation defined the era. Ideas about Nefertiti's role remained plausible, persuasive, and untested. The system worked only as long as no tool existed to challenge it directly. Once that changed, the entire framework was exposed. When DNA closed in around Nefertiti, In the early 21st century, Egyptian authorities approved a series of DNA projects focused on the royal mummies of the 18th dynasty. These were not symbolic studies. They were designed to answer direct questions about family relationships that history had left unresolved. Scientists began with mummies whose identities were already reasonably secure. One of them was Tutankhamun, the young king whose tomb had been found nearly intact. Another was Akhenaten, the ruler associated with the religious upheaval of the Amarna period. Others included older kings and queens whose burials had survived in hidden caches. By extracting genetic material from bone tissue and comparing inherited markers, researchers could identify parents, siblings, and children with a level of confidence that written records could never provide. As results came in, a clear family structure began to form. Tutankhamun was confirmed as the biological son of Akhenaten. Akhenaten himself was linked to the previous royal generation. Other mummies, once labeled as unknown or debated figures, were placed into the same genetic network. What had once been guesswork turned into a biological map. What made this process different from earlier scholarship was what it did not use. Titles were ignored, inscriptions were irrelevant. Status did not matter. DNA followed inheritance patterns that could not be shaped by politics or belief. A mother either passed on her genetic markers or she did not. There was no room for interpretation. Within this process, expectations were clear. If Nefertiti had been biologically central to the royal line, she should have appeared naturally within the data. Maternal DNA does not require the mother's body to be present because it survives through her children and descendants. Her genetic signature should have shown up as a mother, a grandmother, or at least a direct ancestor. The system was designed to reveal exactly that kind of connection. But as the results accumulated, something unsettling became clear. Nefertiti did not appear anywhere in the genetic structure. No maternal link pointed to her, no ancestral line traced back to her. According to the available data, she was absent from every biological pathway that led to the throne. At first, some observers expected this to change with further testing. According to some interpretations, it seemed reasonable to assume that a missing sample or an unidentified mummy might still resolve the issue. That expectation, however, depended on the idea that the genetic picture was incomplete. What made this moment difficult to ignore was not just that Nefertiti failed to appear, it was that others did. The DNA did not produce an empty chart. It produced a crowded one. Parents were found. Siblings were matched. Entire branches of the family were reconstructed. Within that growing clarity, her absence stood out sharply. By this stage, the explanation that she was simply missing from the record became harder to defend. A woman assumed to be central to succession should not vanish from a genetic structure that consistently identified close family relationships. The silence was no longer symbolic, it was biological. Instead of confirming what generations had assumed, the data began pointing somewhere else entirely. Instead of Nefertiti, another woman was starting to emerge from the evidence. The woman DNA identified instead of Nefertiti. As the genetic map of the royal family took shape, one mummy began to stand out. She was not known by a famous name. Researchers referred to her as the Younger Lady, a woman found in a side chamber of a royal tomb, badly damaged and long debated by scholars. For decades, she had been a mystery with no clear place in history. DNA changed that. When scientists compared her genetic markers with those of Tutankhamun, the result was unmistakable. The Younger Lady was his biological mother. This was not a weak or partial match. According to reports from the research teams, the inheritance pattern was clear and repeatable. The conclusion did not rely on titles, burial goods, or assumptions. It came straight from shared DNA. The shock deepened as analysis continued. The Younger Lady was not identified as a foreign princess brought into the royal family for alliance. She was not a secondary queen elevated through marriage. Genetic testing showed that she was a close blood relative within the ruling house itself. When her DNA was compared to that of Akhenaten, the result was even more disturbing. She was his full sister. This meant that Tutankhamun was born from a union between brother and sister. It was incest of the closest degree. According to some scholars, this confirmed long-standing concerns about how royal bloodlines were maintained during this period. The idea that the ruling family kept power pure by keeping it within itself was no longer theoretical. It was written into the DNA. This discovery overturned decades of expectation. Nefertiti, long assumed to be the biological center of the dynasty, was suddenly displaced. The most important maternal role in the royal line did not belong to the most visible woman in Egypt. It belonged to someone almost completely erased from memory. What makes this even more unsettling is what the younger lady did not leave behind. There are no great statues bearing her face. No monumental reliefs celebrate her role. No public titles proclaim her importance. Her name, if it was ever recorded, has not survived. She did not dominate walls or rituals. She did not shape ideology. Yet biologically, she mattered more than anyone else. The contrast is stark. Nefertiti filled temples and state imagery. She defined how power looked. The younger lady defined how power was passed on. One ruled the public story. The other carried the bloodline forward. Until DNA spoke, history favored the woman who was seen. According to some interpretations, this may explain why the younger lady was treated the way she was in death. Her body shows signs of violence and hasty burial. Her identity was stripped away. If she represented a dangerous truth about the royal family, silence would have been useful. By this point, the implications were unavoidable. The royal bloodline of the late 18th dynasty could now be traced without Nefertiti. Every biological link leading to Tutankhamun was accounted for, and her name was not among them. At this point, Nefertiti was no longer missing by chance. She was missing by exclusion. The DNA verdict on Nefertiti. Once the royal family tree was genetically accounted for, there were no remaining biological roles left for Nefertiti to occupy. She could not be the mother of the king. That role was already filled. She could not be the grandmother, because the maternal line had been traced back through a different woman. She could not be a hidden ancestor whose influence skipped a generation, because the surrounding relationships had already been mapped. According to reports from the research teams, every direct biological pathway leading to the throne had been identified. At this point, absence stopped being a gap and became evidence. Missing data can often be explained by loss, damage, or time. Exclusion works differently. When every adjacent position in a family line is occupied, the figure who does not appear is not missing by chance. She does not belong within that structure. For decades, scholars expected Nefertiti to appear naturally once DNA analysis began. Her prominence made that expectation feel reasonable. She was assumed to be biologically central because she dominated the historical record. When she failed to appear, the reaction was not emotional. According to some scholars, it was analytical. The structure itself rejected her. This led to a clear conclusion. DNA analysis showed that Nefertiti was not the biological mother of the heir. It also showed that she was not part of the close blood network that shaped the dynasty's genetic collapse. This conclusion did not rely on interpretation or probability. It followed directly from exclusion. The genetic system left no space for her. The effect of this finding was immediate. One of the most familiar narratives of ancient Egypt could no longer stand. The long-held idea of a powerful royal couple producing the next ruler collapsed under scrutiny. Nefertiti's role in succession had been assumed for so long that it felt foundational. DNA removed that foundation. What remained was deeply unsettling. The most iconic woman in Egyptian history was biologically peripheral to the dynasty she appeared to define. She stood at the center of imagery, ceremony, and ideology, but not at the center of inheritance. Power and blood followed different paths. This forced historians to rethink how authority actually functioned during her lifetime. If Nefertiti was not the biological anchor of the dynasty, then lineage alone could not explain her influence. Her power had to come from position, access, and control of symbols rather than genes. If she was not the biological center of power, then the question becomes what she truly was. What Nefertiti actually represented after DNA. After DNA removed Nefertiti from the biological core of the dynasty, her role had to be reconsidered. She was not the mother who carried the line forward. She was something else. Evidence now points to Nefertiti as a political and ideological force, not a dynastic one. Her power did not flow through blood. It flowed through visibility, access, and control of meaning. According to some scholars, her image functioned as a stabilizer at a moment when the royal bloodline was fragile. The dynasty was narrowing. Health problems were spreading. Succession was uncertain. In that context, a powerful public figure could project strength where biology could not. Nefertiti's presence filled that gap. She stood where reassurance was needed. This helps explain why she was elevated so aggressively in art and ritual. She appears repeatedly because repetition creates certainty. She performs kingly acts because authority needed reinforcement. Her image did not reflect biological reality. It corrected for it. Visibility became a substitute for weakness inside the family line. DNA also changes how beauty is read. For centuries, Nefertiti's face was taken as proof of harmony, health, and continuity. Genetic evidence strips that assumption away. Beauty no longer signals biological success. It signals political design. What looks natural is revealed as constructed. This forces a broader shift in how power in ancient Egypt is understood. Authority was not only inherited, it was managed. Images could carry weight equal to blood. Ritual could mask instability. Nefertiti's role shows how carefully power was staged when succession was at risk. Her missing body now matters more, not less. It points to how tightly her image was controlled and how selectively her story was preserved. According to some interpretations, erasing the body while preserving the image allowed the system to keep what it needed and discard what it did not. DNA did not diminish Nefertiti. It exposed the structure that depended on her. She was not the source of the bloodline. She was the solution to its failure. If you enjoyed watching this video, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel.